Welcome to day 2 of the conference. My name's Chris Dolan, and I've been charged with the responsibility of just trying to bring together some of the threads of day 1. Perhaps instead of a welcome to country, what I might suggest that we do is that all of us at some stage in the very near future have a look at the Uluru Statement from the heart and think deeply about constitutional recognition of Aboriginal people. I think it's probably one of the things that a group like ours could be taking a lead on, and it's certainly a topic that where I think we can develop a greater affinity for the original inhabitants and certainly form a position around their appropriate recognition. So thank you to Mickey for that opening yesterday, which I thought was terrific. The Minister too, as you know, was very articulate for those who were here, went on a bit. But I extracted a couple of things that were really not at the heart of his work at all, and I know he did talk at length about legislative reform, and some of that I thought was quite interesting and useful to us, but he did make reference to being very conscious of the full inboxes and the massive number of transactions that you undertake on a daily basis. He talked about the amount that's asked of you and the work you do on behalf of the government, and the principles are our first line of consultation and collaboration. Now, I'm quite interested in that last statement, given that one of my pastimes since I've been out of my work with the Education Department has been to try and mobilise people towards being more politically involved in the work of our department. And so I take that last assertion of his as a promise that you will be consulted and that you will be involved in the work of policy making more fruitfully in the future. The day kicked off with Alan Reid in provocative form as usual, but also giving us a really strong futuristic perspective around artificial intelligence, this idea of utopian and dystopian possibilities, what are the issues, dilemmas and challenges for us as we embark on an AI world. And so Alan, though, was able to weave the AI theme into one of his pet topics around the neoliberalising of the school system, and I thought did that very skillfully in terms of describing a standardised policy discourse and the possibilities in a future-focused discourse. And he did make the claim that this involved bringing educators back to the centre stage, and again I reference my political interest here in terms of getting you more heavily involved in policy work and decision making. Alan too, this one, we didn't make much of this, but Peter made brief reference to Alan having cricket commitments, but he's actually captain of the Australian over 70s cricket team, a very skillful cricketer. And he said to me, and I think there's probably some metaphoric possibilities in this, he said, now that I'm captain I can field in the slips, I don't have to be in the outfield anymore. And I said, I liken that to principals getting the principal job and not having to roam around in the outfield so much. But I noticed that in John's presentation, John, you made reference to the fact that principals are in fact walking out into classrooms and interpreting instructional leadership that way. And so perhaps you need to spend more time in the slips. To John's presentation, and again, John did a fantastic job in the afternoon. For those who weren't here yesterday, one of the really difficult shifts I always think, his learning, teaching and leading in an innovation age was a very stimulating topic, but John dealt with it in a really engaging way, and I've only picked up a few things, John. I can't do justice to your whole presentation, but the real-time data collection exercise that you ran and asked questions about how many kids were switched on in your school and how many staff were switching on kids, I thought were really interesting questions. And because this was done in real time, it was a fascinating exercise to see the body of opinion emerge from the room. John spent a lot of time too on an old school, new school paradigm, and I thought this had strong resonance with what Alan had said earlier about a future-focused discourse. Again, very thought-provoking in terms of that shift from one place to another, and the argument I would make is that's a shift we have to make as a struggle rather than something that's going to happen quite naturally in our working lives. And again, there's a political interest in that. John also developed themes around parents signing up kids for schooling of the past, getting ready for a new reality, an interconnected world, a vision for learning and equity, and the curve of forgetting. And I was sitting next to John at dinner last night, and I said, "What was that curve called again?" He said, "No, I can't remember." And we were struggling to get the name of it, but it's actually called the curve of forgetting. And I reckon I'm at the peak somewhere. The workshops, and this is where I really was too ambitious. I tried to get around to all of the workshops, and I was actually running one myself as well. And it was like, you know, when you pass people on the streets and you hear a snippet of conversation, it was a bit like that in the end. And so I can't do them justice, but these were some of the topics. Certainly Donna Pendergast, that most people heard speak, working in that context of the changes to Year 7, talked about being intentional about the learning needs and the learning places of young adolescent learners. The group from Victor Harbour, Hallett Cove, and what was the other school involved? Sorry? ASMS. Sorry, Jane. The practitioner inquiry work I thought was outstanding. I didn't see enough of it, but the understanding of the research process and the understanding of the need to be engaged in research at school level, I thought was well advanced in that group. And you know, not only was the research itself interesting, but so was the methodology that people had used and some of the data that they were accumulating. The topic of autonomy, of course, deeply interesting to us. Interesting to me because in my workshop I talked about autonomy quite differently in terms of it being a technology of government. The idea that in some ways what autonomy does is focus attention on you and your work, and in some ways sets you up to be more vulnerable in a political sense, because it apportions or seems to apportion some power to you, but also some responsibility on behalf of government. And so I think the autonomy question needs to be debated a lot more, and I know that there is a research project in that space. The idea of dwelling in the space of struggle was interesting to me, and this came up in the research workshops. And in the ICT workshop, I noticed the sentiment about pedagogy continuing to be important in any shift that we make towards an ICT-based classroom practice. We must shift our pedagogy at the same time. In summary, one way of thinking about yesterday, I think, is in terms of the tensions that were raised. And I haven't captured near the amount of two-sided issues that were raised across the whole day, but stuff like the old school, new school tension, the tension between excellence and equity came up as a theme in a number of workshops. The tension between high-stakes testing and school-based pedagogical practice. The residualisation of low SES schools, which is an issue of particular interest to me, and for those people who are in low SES settings, the way that some of the most able kids in your communities are not in your schools, and what that means in terms of the exacerbation of disadvantage in your settings, I think is a major tension. The inequity of funding was raised around resourcing across the school sectors, and autonomy systems membership was another tension that I mentioned just a moment ago, and the one that Alan focused on, the standardised discourse and the future-focused discourse. I just wanted to mention, I wanted to segue from Alan's work into something that I'm doing for SASPA and for SAPA. At the end of Alan's book, Alan's monograph, this one that was commissioned by ASPA, he makes a strong case for the fourth industrial revolution, but doesn't go far into the political work of leaders except to say these things. That if the case study does anything, it shows that, like it or not, education is a highly political activity. He says that educators have tended not to become engaged in the political process, and rather than wait and then react, educators must become involved in shaping public opinion and policy directions. And yesterday he talked about the importance of scepticism and discernment as two attributes that leaders will need as we embark on what he described as that fourth industrial revolution. My project segues straight from the end of Alan's book, really. I've asked the question of principles in a qualitative research project that I'm involved with on behalf of SASPA and SAPA, which asks the question, what is the evidence-based political project for school leaders? And I think this is a really interesting area, given that this is the sort of leadership that we talk about most often. We're very keen on these putting adjectives in front of leadership and describing ourselves as transformational or instructional or relational or whatever, but we very rarely talk about ourselves as political leaders. And I think that all of these struggles that I've mentioned, and I'll add a few in a minute, this is the work I'm doing, these tensions have come up, and just see if you recognise these. These have come up in the study, and this is just some early data that I've been looking at. But these are quite clear from the interview study that I've conducted over across the state in many secondary and primary schools, that there's a tension between the system's goals and priorities and the goals and priorities of your school. A lot of people notice that. Between the external accountabilities that are applied to you and your work and those that and your need to act autonomously. The centralised measures of success that are valued and the positive achievements that you value in your own school. Being the leader of teaching and learning in your school, but then attending to the daily demands of the job. Are these tensions that people recognise across the room? Because these are certainly very clear in the data. The tension brought on by the management of underperforming staff is one that comes up a lot. A need to sometimes oppose or resist centralised policy demands and the personal risk involved in such opposition or resistance. And the tension arising from school complexity and workload and related issues of mental health and wellbeing, which I think has been a kind of theme that has run through as well. That's some of the early work. Just one other thing. Look, all of those words there describe what people do to policy when it comes into schools. And these have come directly from the data that I've collected. These are things that people say that they do. And I'm putting this up because this is an area of agency that we don't often think about. That when a policy comes across your desk, what's your attitude to that work? And where do you find your own leadership agency in that process of centralised policy being translated into the sites? So people do a lot with this, do a lot with policy. They're not conduits for central office policy. Principals in the room are creative people who work to create a space in order to work with the policy in ways that will be effective on their site. So this idea of central input and local inflections is really important because I think it's one of the places where we do find our agency. I'm suggesting a definition of policy that broadens the term out to include the work that you do on policy, not just the stuff that comes to you in documented form from central office. This is it. I'll finish, Peter. So in the policy work, what I'm asking you to think about is what can schools do to enact the policy locally? We know that problems are formulated centrally, policy's written, it's rolled out to schools. What then is your sphere of influence in that area? I'll just leave you with one other thing, because I want to just generate a round of applause for SASPA, because one of the things I notice in my research is that people have consistently shown high regard for SASPA and for SAPA in the work that I've done. People rely on SASPA and SAPA for a political voice. They rely on the risk mitigation that goes on when you do gather collectively as an organisation. So I think just on behalf of the group, not just because of the organisation of the conference, but I think for SASPA and its executive and for SAPA and their executive, I think we should congratulate them on their work. Thanks very much.